Colonel Gianna Martinez walked into a convenience store near her home on a peaceful Saturday morning. No one would have guessed that the short woman wearing a worn cowhide jacket was the leader of a squad of soldiers on the battlefield. This morning, she temporarily left the training ground to freely choose her favorite items before returning to her new home in the suburbs of Austin, Texas. But she had no idea that the peaceful atmosphere here was about to be broken by a seemingly small action. As she strolled through the aisles, enjoying the temporary escape from her high-stakes world, the peaceful atmosphere was suddenly disrupted. A loud crash echoed through the store, causing several shoppers to turn their heads. In a split second, Gianna's sharp eyes quickly darted to the source of the noise. Officer Leo Lewis, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stiff posture, had accidentally knocked over a display shelf, sending packages of sausages and cans of beers crashing to the floor. However, he glanced at the mess, his expression indifferent, before casually turning away as if it were someone else's problem. Meanwhile, Gianna hesitated for a moment, expecting him to at least admit it. But no, he didn't. At least, the look in his eyes said so. And that made a familiar instinct rise within her, the same instinct that had guided her through years of service. She wasn't one to let irresponsibility go unchecked, especially from someone who represented law and order. Calmly, she stepped forward, bending down to pick up one of the fallen packs of sausages. "Excuse me, officer," she said in a composed but firm tone. "I think you dropped something." Leo turned to her, his gaze cold and uninterested. He studied her for a second before scoffing. "Who are you supposed to be?" he asked, his voice laced with arrogance. "You don't get to tell me what to do?" Gianna remained unfazed. Years of military service had trained her to face far worse than an entitled officer with an attitude problem. "I just think it's common courtesy," she replied evenly, placing the pack back on the shelf. "We all have a responsibility to keep public spaces clean." Leo crossed his arms and let out a short, mocking laugh. "I'm busy keeping this neighborhood safe." "I don't have time to pick up a few sausages," he said dismissively, waving a hand as if the conversation wasn't worth his time. Gianna raised an eyebrow. "And setting an example for the community isn't part of that?" she countered. "A good officer leads by action." The tension in the air thickened. A few nearby shoppers had stopped browsing, their attention drawn to the exchange. Some reached for their phones, sensing that this confrontation was about to escalate. Leo, seemingly unbothered, smirked at Gianna. "Lady, you have no idea what it means to be a cop," he sneered. "Why don't you go mind your own business?" Gianna exhaled slowly, keeping her composure. She had faced condescending remarks before, but there was something about Leo's dismissive tone that struck a nerve. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been belittled or ignored. "I know exactly what responsibility looks like," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of a leader. "It means holding yourself to a higher standard, especially when others are watching." Leo's smirk faltered for a split second before he rolled his eyes. "Look, lady, I don't need a lecture." Gianna met his gaze head-on, unwavering. "No," she said, "you need accountability." The silence that followed was deafening. The crowd around them had grown, a silent audience to the growing standoff. Leo glanced around, noticing the curious and disapproving stares aimed in his direction. For the first time since their encounter began, uncertainty flickered across his face, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. With a slow, deliberate motion, he adjusted the holster at his waist, as if reminding everyone, including Gianna, of the power he carried. "You're making a big deal out of nothing," he said, his voice low but charged with warning. Gianna didn't flinch. She had seen men like him before. Men who mistook authority for invincibility, who believed power was a shield against consequences. But she also knew something else. No one was above accountability. Before we continue the story, comment below where you are watching today. And if you like stories like this, then don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss any new stories. More shoppers abandoned their carts, drawn by the scene unfolding before them. And the weight of many eyes on him made Leo shift uncomfortably, though he hid it with a loud laugh. "You think you're special?" he sneered. "Just another nobody trying to act tough." As for Gianna, she remained calm. At least her facial expression said so. She had faced bigger adversaries than a man hiding behind a badge. "Respect isn't given, it's earned," she stated firmly. "And right now, you're proving you don't deserve it." Immediately, Leo laughed mockingly, but he was no longer as confident as before. Instead, a flash of doubt crossed his face. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, a few people whispering about his unprofessionalism. Some even pulled out their phones, recording everything. His jaw tightened. "You're causing a scene," he snapped. "Step back before you regret it." Gianna took a step forward, not out of aggression, but to make a point. "I'm not the one causing a scene," she said coolly. "You did that when you disrespected the badge you wear." Leo's face darkened. He was losing control of the narrative and he knew it. "You're really pushing your luck," he growled. Gianna tilted her head slightly, calm as ever. "Or maybe I'm just reminding you that power doesn't make you untouchable." A hush fell over the store. Leo's hands twitched at his side. The arrogance in his eyes flickered, replaced by something else: frustration, uncertainty. The crowd continued to watch, their silent judgment growing heavier by the second. Gianna could see it now. Leo was unraveling, and she wasn't going to let him off the hook that easily. Leo clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. His breathing grew heavy, nostrils flaring as he searched for a way to regain control of the situation. Gianna noticed his stance shifting, his fingers hovering closer to his holster. The tension in the store reached a boiling point. "You're embarrassing yourself, officer," Gianna said, her voice calm but firm. "You're making it clear to everyone here that you believe you're above accountability." Leo let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Accountability?" he spat. "You don't get to lecture me about accountability, lady." Gianna squared her shoulders, her posture unwavering. "A real officer serves and protects," she said, "not intimidates and humiliates." Leo's expression twisted in anger. "You don't know anything about what it takes to keep these streets safe," he snapped. "People like you." He cut himself off, but the implication hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. The racist undertone of Leo's words was impossible to ignore. Gianna's jaw tightened, but she refused to let anger dictate her next move. "People like me?" she echoed, her voice unwavering. "You mean people who stand up to bullies? People who refuse to be silenced?" Leo's hand instinctively moved toward his gun. He glared at Gianna, his voice turning rigid and aggressive. "You need to walk away. Right now." Gianna, however, didn't budge. She had stared down threats far greater than this. "You think that badge gives you the right to pull a gun on an unarmed citizen?" she asked, her voice dangerously low. "Or are you finally realizing that you've lost control?" Leo's grip tightened around his holster, but his hesitation was evident. The judgmental eyes of the crowd, the phone cameras pointed at him, the murmurs of disapproval, it was all closing in on him. Leo stepped forward, his voice growing harsher and more aggressive. "I warn you, don't make this situation worse," he snapped. "I'm a cop, and I have the authority to deal with you right here and now." His words rang out, but instead of instilling fear in Gianna, They only strengthened her resolve. Gianna calmly pulled out her phone. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if she had expected this all along. There was no hesitation, no rush in her movements. She pressed a button and raised the phone to her ear. "Yes, I'd like to report an officer abusing his power and threatening a civilian." Leo's eyes widened, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. He hadn't expected that. His grip on his holster loosened momentarily. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. A few people stopped recording and began dialing their own phones. "You think calling for backup will help you?" Leo scoffed, but there was a faint tremor in his voice now. His fingers twitched at his sides. "I think the law will decide," Gianna replied smoothly, her fingers steady around her phone. The blaring sound of sirens filled the air. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows as several police cars pulled up outside. Leo stiffened, his shoulders locking. The tension in the store had reached its peak. The crowd instinctively stepped aside as uniformed officers entered the building. At the head of the group was Mayor Grayson Allen, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp as they scanned the situation. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched behind his back. Leo straightened his stance. "Sir, this is just a misunderstanding." His voice was firm, but lacked its earlier confidence. Grayson held up a hand, silencing him instantly. His eyes burned into Leo's. He turned to Gianna, nodding slightly. "Colonel Martinez," he addressed her formally, recognizing her immediately. "What's happening here?" Gianna met his gaze firmly. "This officer has been abusing his authority, threatening me, and displaying conduct unbecoming of his position." Grayson turned his gaze back to Leo, his expression cold. "Is that so?" Before Leo could find an excuse, a woman in her 50s wearing an elegant floral dress with shoulder-length hair stepped forward from the crowd. "I have it all on video," she announced, holding up her phone. "Everything he said, everything he did." Then Grayson reached out and took the phone the woman gave him. He pressed the play button while the store suddenly became as silent as a deserted island, and Grayson did not blink as he watched the evidence of Leo's guilt being shown before his eyes. When the video ended, anyone could feel the anger burning inside Grayson's body, and the mayor's lips pressed into a straight line that said it all. "This behavior is unacceptable." Grayson Allen's voice was filled with authority as he glared at Officer Leo Lewis. He turned to the officers behind him. "Disarm him." Now, the room fell into a tense silence before the officers behind Grayson stepped forward, their movements swift and deliberate. Leo's eyes darted between them, his face paling as one officer reached for his gun. He instinctively moved to resist, but the weight of the moment pressed down on him. With a resigned stiffness, he unfastened the holster strap and let the weapon be taken from him. Another officer reached for his badge, the silver emblem that once symbolized power and duty, now nothing more than a reminder of his disgrace. As it was stripped from his chest, a murmur rippled through the crowd. Then suddenly, a burst of applause broke out. Everyone clapped together without any warning. Shoppers, workers, and onlookers clapped, their approval ringing through the store like a thunderous verdict. Some cheered, while others shook their heads in disgust at Leo. That made a middle-aged black man wearing a dark blue t-shirt with silver hair exclaimed, "I have lived in Texas for almost 60 years, but this is the first time he has witnessed with his own eyes the scene of police being held accountable for wrongdoing." And in his voice, he was pleased that justice was served. As for Gianna Martinez, who had been steadfast throughout the ordeal, she breathed a sigh of relief as if the boulder on her shoulders had been thrown away. She hadn't sought recognition, nor had she wanted a spectacle, but in that moment, as justice was meted out, a deep sense of relief washed over her. She had seen too many abuses of power go unchecked, And this time, things had played out differently. To Grayson, he turned to her, the expression in his eyes changing from firm determination to admiration. "Colonel Martinez," he said, addressing her formally, "your actions today embodied true leadership. You held a man accountable where many would have walked away. I commend you." Gianna met his gaze, her eyes steady. "Thank you, Mayor Allen," she replied. "I only hope this isn't just one moment of justice, but the start of real change." Grayson nodded, his expression grave. "It will be. I promise you. We will not allow this kind of conduct to continue unchecked." He turned back to his officers. "Take him in for questioning. Ensure that an internal investigation begins immediately." Meanwhile, Leo, now stripped of his powers, stood still like a lifeless statue. It didn't stop there. His previous arrogant demeanor crumbled, replaced by uncertainty and fear, as the officers on either side of him grabbed his arms and led him to the exit, while the crowd parted with whispers of condemnation, following him as he was marched out. At the same time, flashing red and blue lights illuminated his pale face as he was placed into the patrol car. "This isn't over," Leo muttered under his breath, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. He had lost control of the situation, and for the first time, he knew it. As the doors of the police cruiser slammed shut, discussions broke out among the crowd. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others voiced their disgust. The entire incident had been recorded, and within minutes, social media was flooded with footage of Leo's behavior. By the time Leo arrived at the precinct, the videos had already gone viral. News outlets had picked up the story, flashing headlines condemning the officer's misconduct. Calls for police reform intensified as the footage made its rounds. At the station, Leo was immediately questioned, his rights read to him like any other suspect. The evidence against him, both video and witness testimony, left little room for defense. The chief of police didn't hesitate. "Leo Lewis's actions are a disgrace to this department," he announced publicly. Effective immediately, he is suspended pending further investigation. But the consequences didn't stop there. As the media storm raged on, more voices emerged from the shadows. People who had been victims of Leo's abuse of power in the past came forward, recounting their own experiences. The pattern of misconduct was undeniable, and with each new testimony, Leo's fall from grace became irreversible. Even those who had once stood beside him distanced themselves. His colleagues refused to defend him, disgusted by his blatant disregard for the badge they all swore to uphold. Friends and acquaintances, once loyal, now turned their backs. The community, the very people he had sworn to protect, condemned him without hesitation. Alone in his small apartment, Leo sat in silence. The walls around him seemed to close in, the weight of his actions finally settling on his shoulders. His career was over. His reputation was shattered, and for the first time, stripped of the power he had once wielded recklessly, he felt something he had never expected. It was regret. But it was too late. Meanwhile, Gianna Martinez continues her life as before, but the impact of her actions rippled through the community. Though she never sought attention, people frequently stopped her to offer gratitude and admiration. To them, she wasn't just a hero. She was proof that accountability still mattered. Not stopping there, her actions not only brought Leo Lewis to justice, they sparked a much larger conversation about ethics and responsibility in law enforcement. Little did she know, discussions about police conduct, racial bias, and accountability would flood the media and social platforms. Change, it seemed, was on the horizon. Elsewhere, Leo faces more than just being fired. Formal charges were brought against him for abuse of power and threatening a civilian with a deadly weapon. Soon after, his trial was swift and damning, with overwhelming evidence from witness testimonies and viral videos. As for him, the arrogance he once displayed was gone. As for him, the arrogance he once displayed was gone. Everyone was surprised to see him sitting in court, his shoulders hunched, his head bowed. On the contrary, he knew that he could not escape the consequences of his actions. As the judge delivered the verdict, Leo remained silent. It was a harsh yet fitting punishment, a reminder that power came with responsibility, and that corruption had no place in a just society. As for Gianna, her life changed dramatically after the incident. No longer just another soldier, she became a symbol of resilience and moral courage. Furthermore, the media hailed her as a modern-day hero, with countless articles and interviews describing her as the face of justice. Yet she remained humble, refusing to see herself as anything more than a person doing the right thing. But Gianna didn't expect that her story would spark a wave of reform in the police force. Immediately, public scrutiny led to tighter oversight, stricter hiring policies, and a push for better ethics training for officers. It didn't stop there, as departments across the country began implementing stricter accountability measures, ensuring that those who wore the badge were actually honoring their duty to protect and serve. Sometime later, Gianna became a keynote speaker at police ethics conferences, sharing her views on leadership, justice, and accountability. She then emphasized that true power lies not in authority, but in integrity and service to the people. Meanwhile, Leo Lewis's downfall continued. His career was over, his name forever associated with disgrace. His former supporters abandoned him, and the community he once patrolled shunned him. His actions had not only destroyed his future, but had also left him in social exile. Alone and humiliated, Leo reflected on the choices that led him here. The unchecked arrogance, the abuse of power. He now saw how his downfall was entirely of his own making. Regret gnawed at him, but it was too late. Gianna's influence continued to grow, inspiring others to stand against injustice. Activists, officers, and ordinary citizens took courage from her story, refusing to stay silent in the face of wrongdoing. Articles, speeches, and social media discussions kept her message alive, ensuring that change was not temporary, but lasting. Even within the military, Gianna's stance reaffirmed the importance of ethical leadership. Her fellow soldiers saw her as a role model, a testament to the fact that true strength came not from force, but from the courage to do what was right. Though she never sought fame, Gianna found fulfillment in knowing that she had made a difference. Looking back, she had no regrets, only pride in standing for justice. She understood that the fight for fairness and integrity was ongoing, requiring unity and perseverance from all corners of society. Her legacy became one of inspiration, not just for those in law enforcement, but for anyone who believed in justice, the marginalized, the voiceless, the oppressed. They found strength in her example, knowing that one person's courage could shift the tides of an entire system. As policies changed and awareness grew, Gianna remained steadfast in her mission. She launched initiatives, organized campaigns, and educated those willing to listen. She knew this was bigger than her. It was about the next generation, about ensuring that no one had to fear those who were meant to protect them. Soon, her name became synonymous with justice, but to Gianna, her greatest reward was knowing she had played a part in making the world a little better. She had fought not for glory, but for what was right. And that, in the end, was what truly mattered. What do you think about Gianna? Where have you met a police officer like Leo? If you find the situation in this story interesting, please press the like button, and if you want to hear similar stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next exciting story.